Starting in three, two, one. Panel, having a tertiary education is great, but insofar as in the status quo, only the most privileged people are able to access good quality tertiary education. We think it is more important to look at the majority who of people who are structurally locked out of a high quality tertiary education because of geographical limitations, because of financial restrictions, so on and so forth. We think that we think that to the extent that people are forced to choose worse off institutions because of these limitations, it is the priority of affirmative side to improve the overall quality of tertiary education and equalize the playing field for people who actually have a chance to access a college degree. But what are the models that we look at on our side of the house when we are moving on or tertiary education online? We think that we will have things like lectures and tutorials online. It is possible for you to still have some sort of like a face-to-face interaction and like simulations of experiments. You can still, to a very large extent, be able to access a lot of things through technology, like VR in the future, or like simulation models that we currently have for like biochem degrees, whatnot. But we think that like for practical professionals like physiologists, specialists, or professionals like doctors, these professions are impossible to like just graduate out of an online degree and go into practice. We think that it is fair for us to say that since it is impossible for you to let a doctor to like operate on a real human body without having any on-the-job experience, we're happy to say that you will first get the degree online and then you will move on to like some houseman internship programs at the hospital, and then you will further qualify into becoming a doctor to work on a real human body. We think that we are going to have official degrees. So we're not talking about like online MLOC courses where a lot of the lecture material and the content are watered down for people who are not aiming at getting an official degree, but just like knowing more about these courses in general. We think that we are talking about like real degrees with certificates with acknowledgement that you can use when you are looking for employment. I'm going to talk about several things in my speech. First, I'm going to talk about how we get better access to a degree for a lot of people. Second, I'm going to talk about how we get a better quality of education in tertiary institutions. Thirdly, I'm going to talk about how this debate is about an organization of resources and how like on-the-job learning or like real experiences would look like on our side of the house. But firstly, why do we generally get better access to a degree at large? As I've mentioned in my opening, like a lot of people who don't have the financial resources cannot access university because of several reasons. So 5 layers of analysis. Firstly, the tuition fee is expensive. A lot of people don't have the ability to pay off that when they're graduating out of high school, or the family have limited means. But secondly, you also have high transportation and transportation costs, or you have the physical barrier of having to move to another city, having to move to another country, which means that your living expenses are probably going to be a lot higher than what you have to pay right now, and you cannot afford it. But thirdly, you also have national boundaries. Recognize that how a lot of most of the top institutions are always located in the Western world, which means that students from other places in the world who wants to receive that quality of high education would physically have to move to the Western world and go to these institutions. But the national boundary means that there are also limitations of visas, how students are always limited by externalities like your politics, like your IR, like Trump revoking the visas of all Chinese students, like Pakistani students not being able to like extend visa while they are already studying a degree in the UK. We think that these externalities largely affect how students are able to access the education, or they will have to drop out because of like reasons that are unlimited, like not related to them. But fourthly, we also say that physically, university have limited physical space. So you get a limitation of resources, things like having dorm rooms, things like accessing a library, things like the size of your lecture hall, education resources, how much people you can physically accommodate on campus. You cannot have like multiply people. You cannot like largely and take a lot more students with what you can accommodate. We say that this like fifthly, we say that the physical organizers of resources are also expensive, because it also means that your university, especially if you're talking about like high-level institutions like Harvard, like the Ivy League, like your Oxford and Cambridge. You spend a lot of money into building your infrastructures, into your like grand halls. These money doesn't necessarily go into projects that directly benefit what the student prioritizes the most. It's cool to have a very grand dining hall, but this is in comparison to the access and the quality of education that we get on outside of the house, probably not as important. But then let us look at what are the trade-off and the comparative in status quo. We think that in reality, a lot of students cannot afford the tuition fees in education, and that's why they always have to take on the part-time jobs. They always have to hustle on the side. They also have to take on like student loans. We think that this, by and large, increases their performance anxiety, like how they perform before an exam, how they cannot really focus on the studies. That's why it's also really harmful to their mental health. We think that education being expensive is a really harmful thing. But then let's talk about like why online degrees are going to be largely cheaper on outside of the house. We think that when you're large, like when the money doesn't go into building like physical stuff, the bulk of your money is going to go into like multiplying the resources that are actually available to the students on the ground. We say that this is where second layer of analysis come in, that your quality of education is better because it goes directly into things like hiring better academics, things like having better journals. We also think that like on a second level, teachers can more likely work on an ad hoc basis. So now if you're like a very famous Harvard professor, it's more likely that you can also give guest lectures at like Chinese institutions, like Indian institutions. It's easier for academics to have conferencing. It's easier for these sort of exchanges of information to happen on outside of the house when you're not limited by the physical barrier. It also means that good teachers can teach in multiple locations at the same time, so you can be like hired as a professor in multiple institutions given that you don't have the geographical constraint. We think that's largely beneficial. But why are online degrees cheaper on outside of the house? We think that like when you're able to use those resources and multiply it online, things like your library books, your video streaming, these things are not limited by your geographical constraints, means that a lot more people can access it. But the impact we get on outside of the house is this: it lowers the tuition fees, which means that a lot more people are going to be able to empower themselves through education. Because now, if you are a poor kid from a poor neighborhood, you will still look into getting like a good quality tertiary degree because you no longer have the financial barrier. That's how a lot of vulnerable people can actually be uplifted out of poverty if they have the official recognition of getting that degree. We also say that the geographical reach of the education is important, and how we are equalizing the playing field for people, because like inequality is also based on the disparity of education resources that the rich and poor get. If degrees are cheaper, poor people are able to access it, and how that's better on outside of the house. But we also say that on our side, we have facilities like sharing agreements, arrangements with the government. We have things like public institutes and private enterprises. We think that we can still have secondment, we can still have like internships, we can still have a curriculum that accommodates these sort of things. So in the status quo, private enterprises already invest a lot in institutions. The difference is the resources will be organized around the enterprises and provided by alternative sites on our means. We think the comparative of equalizing the quality and access of education is more important. We think that we prioritize having the base knowledge of like the overall population being improved, and for these reasons, we are proud to propose.
Thank you so much for that speech. Now calling on first negative to start the case of negative. Thank you.
Hi, can I be heard?
Yes, it's clear.
Panel, it is unclear to me why tertiary education is the be-all or end-all of a person's education. The reasons why people don't attend uni are not limited to just finances or geography. It is often because they are not interested. It is often because they want to go immediately into trade and their family business. And that is something which is legitimate and something which we ought care about in this debate. And to the extent that side affirmative team cares so much about access, at the point where you widen access to presumably the extent which side affirmative wants to claim all the benefits, that was going to be uniquely bad for poor people, right? Because at the point where everyone can go and get an Oxford economics degree, that degree is likely to become meaningless in the eyes of the employer, which therefore means when you're choosing who you want to employ based on this economics degree, it is not going to be based on do you go to Oxford. It will be based on arbitrary markers of privilege, such as do you have networks and connections, where are you from, and traditional markers of privilege, which uniquely locks out poorer people from being able to access better employment because these standards are far more arbitrary and unlikely to be useful there. That is why side affirmative cannot win this debate. So the first thing I'm going to establish here is what is the counterprop under side negative. Firstly, we tell you about the world we envision is what was the pre-COVID-19 kind of world where you have in-person classes. Obviously, proportions of classes can still be uploaded online, such as an in-person lecture gets posted online afterwards for revision purposes, and there can be online quizzes. That is something which we largely support, but where possible, we will prioritize in-person classes. So I'm going to do three things in this speech. Firstly, talk about why in-person uni is better. Secondly, talk about monopolies, and lastly, talk about research. So why is in-person uni better? Many reasons. Because firstly, we tell you in person you get better real life engagement between classes. This is important because at the point where you're able to have tutorials where there's only 30 people, a lecturer or a tutor is able to engage with individual questions and concerns at a personal level, which is allowed to get a more interactive lesson where problems are addressed in a way which is more dynamic and more engaging for everyone involved. The second reason is that teachers are likely just to have more passion online. Passion when you're in person, because when you're talking to a real person, you can see a reaction and you can be driven by that sort of thing. Obviously, when you're online and talking to a Zoom call of 50 black faces, that is going to be incredibly terrible and incredibly unengaging, which means you're unlikely to be motivated to talk in a way which is engaging and talk in a way which is going to be good for the students to get a good education. The third thing to be said here is that side of affirmative try to claim that, well, we can simulate stuff like online practice and biochemistry, but there are simply some things you cannot replicate, right? Like in-person classes mean that if you do a science degree or a vet or engineering degree, you have to have practical classes where you do the experiment yourself. You dissect that rat yourself in a biology course, and you're able to build up fancy stuff during engineering classes. And that practical experience was uniquely important during a university career that could not be compensated for by internships afterwards or just a video of watching an experiment happen online. That was unique to these degrees and important for kids to be able to, students to be able to engage with their career in a meaningful way, and you lose that, and I simply just lose that. The fourth thing you said is that the experience will be incredibly worse for students, right? Because at the point where uni is online and everything's occurring in the leisure of your own homes, when you have incredibly poor schedules and the fact that you have to wake up and sit in front of your laptop for an entire day with no social aspect, we can get coffee with a mate before class, that was going to be incredibly depressing and also probably incredibly unhealthy for individuals to be in such an isolated and alienating experience. I think that simply is something we ought not prefer. The fifth thing to be said here is social life obviously gets worse because maybe you can have some extracurricular activity, but the very fact that you're likely not to make friends with people in an online class, but to go and make friends because you interact in society or interact with other people during your classes, that was something which you no longer get when things are permanently moved online and you're just by yourself and just forced to learn a bunch of material which you might or might not really care that much about. I think an example of this looks like is, for example, sports club like boxing societies or soccer societies and netball societies simply would not be able to exist without some structure to be said that if you're interested in this, you can come on campus after class and play a good game and have fun with your friends. And that was particularly bad. The sixth thing to be said why quality gets worse, exams are going to be worse when they're online because there are still incentives to test knowledge in a meaningful way, and there's either two options of that. Firstly, either you have long time exams about any online proximate, which leads to more cheating, which leads to a decrease in reputation, which therefore means universities are unincentivized to do that. Or then secondly, when you have online proctors to test people do exams, that was a particularly invasive and terrible kind of process because firstly, you literally have someone like a random person from a different country looking into your room to see whether you're doing anything, or secondly, to take all your data and all the information you have on your laptops in the process. That was something individuals could never consent to, and something which is a massive harm that had to cop under their side of the house. The impacts of this argument is just that firstly, the quality of university and education gets worse for both students and teachers. The second thing is that students are likely to be worse graduates because they don't get the same investment or practical skills from in-person uni, which keeps them going. And the third thing we said is that you devalue the importance of university because at the point where everyone can get it and you get some like piss poor online university degree, it is unlikely to be seen as something which is probative for employees and something which is important. As a result, experience gets absolutely cooked and the education that decreases, they can't win on quality. The second argument I'm going to talk about here is why some unis are going to monopolize the market. The first thing to establish here is that since online gets cheaper and presumably gets cheaper and you can access a wider base of people, it It means people are incentivized to go to universities with a better brand name, like say Harvard or Oxford. The implication of this is that there are now two types of universities. Firstly, those who are in the top 50, or secondly, those who are not in the top 50 and are just random universities which don't have much net reputation or repute. Why this argument is important here is because it means students are less incentivized to attend these universities with no repute, and because demand goes down, and as a result, universities like Harvard and Oxford are able to gain some form of monopoly because everyone wants to go into these areas. Notably, universities like Harvard and Oxford can't do that in the status quo because they're constrained by things like land and amount of space they have. When you move into cyberspace, the barrier obviously goes away. The impact of this argument is that firstly, local institutions are now likely to go bankrupt when this monopoly occurs, and as a result, what is the result of that? Is that firstly, you're likely to reduce the amount of access just because these bigger universities presumably still have some sort of admission standard which not everyone can get into. The second thing is that you have a reduced quality within these bigger institutions because now you reduce competition from all these small institutions who could pull away revenue bases for you, which means that you're unlikely to see UNSW and University of Sydney compete against each other to offer better courses because now there are only a few where everyone attends the same sort of classes and lectures. The third thing is that you get less educational diversity because everyone now thinks the exact same way in the way that Harvard or Oxford teaches their students, and that was probably bad in discouraging creativity. The second harm is also just that in order to reduce costs and to make this a viable model, many universities are now to partner up with tech firms who have to expand stuff like server hosting or improving online platforms. This is uniquely harmful because when you have corporate interests invade a public space like university, it means now they have the ability to control university research into what the tech firms have interest in, or alternatively control what the government funding should go to. That was particularly bad because it was likely to only serve corporate interests as opposed to researching things which benefit the whole of humanity, like for example humanities or the arts, and we think that we probably shouldn't be beholden to shareholder interests in such a way. The last thing I'm going to talk about in this debate is therefore on research. The thing to establish about this is, why does research get exponentially worse? Because as affirmative claims, this was going to get exponentially cheaper in order to improve access. The first thing established is when there is less money, there is a perception that a university degree has less value. This is harmful because when you have less money, the two main areas it goes to during teaching is firstly either teachers who now have to work the same hours and produce the same content for a lot less money, or secondly public research, which is notably uniquely done in universities, and it has a serious impact on discourse because at the point where you cut funding to research and no longer put in that much money, it means discourses around climate change, discourses around vaccinations, and how we should grow as a society reduce a lot more because academics have a reduced capacity to be able to produce papers which impact the way we think and impact the way we feel. And notably, the cuts here probably occur to things like humanities, which have perception which is less useful than science and technology, and as a result, that was going to be particularly damaging to the way universities operate. How we should behave. So at the end of the speech, I've proven to you why the quality of the university gets worse. Access is not actually a benefit here, and as a result, very proud to oppose.
Thank you so much for that speech. Now calling on second affirmative. You're here.
Hello, am I audible?
You are.
Hello, hello. Am I audible?
Yes. Hello. You're clear. Yes.
Yeah, that's lovely. Just give me 1 second with the papers and my timer, all right?
Yeah, sure.
All right, am I still audible? Just making sure before I jump in.
Yes, perfectly clear.
Yes, that's lovely. I'm sorry, just give me 1 second because you're a bit soft on the mic. So I just want to make sure that my voice is still loud, right? Because I can't really hear the response in the mic.
Yes, yeah.
Okay, that's lovely. Sorry about that text though.
No problem.
Lovely, just give me 1 second. I'll be starting in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. I think Op's case is very privileged to the extent that their impacts are largely about stuff like not having a university sports team or the inability for you to, for instance, like socialize with your friends and things like that. The first thing I'm going to talk about is the frame. The second thing I'm going to talk about is why in particular we're able to get better research engaging the best case and what we already preempted as the likely push from Op. Thirdly, I'm going to talk about how this expands the scope of what universities do and why that's particularly good. Lastly, if time allows, some extraneous refutation. The first is the frame, right? I don't think Op really engaged in our idea that access to education is more important than the quality of the education itself, because the best piece of everything from Op only focuses on the minute, like sort of interactions you have in school and why that gets it marginally improved when you're in person. There are four principal reasons why access to education is more important. The first is that broadly this is a principled right to the extent that every individual, because of the fact that they're arbitrarily born in an area that cannot access education on that side of the house, it's a principled right to restore this by allowing for a more egalitarian distribution of education for these people. The second reason is broadly the people who are benefited on our side are far more vulnerable than the people who are harmed on their side. Because notice the majority of their stuff, like social interactions and things like that, only apply to people who are privileged enough to engage in these activities that quite often, as fraternities and societies go, have high barriers of entry and high barriers of privilege. I think on our side, far more vulnerable people who are locked away systematically from social empowerment and are stemmed in inequality are far better going to be benefited at the point at which we manage access for them. Thirdly, egalitarian access is good, is a principle good that should be defended, even if you reduce the quality of that access. The analogy for this is, for instance, when you allow for every individual to have the right to vote, individuals who are more privileged can, for instance, corrupt or bribe officials to get better policies passed, because the ability for them to corrupt or bribe is not distributed in an equal fashion amongst different individuals. We would rather there be worse off policies in order to preserve the right of every individual to access these things. That's why we do not allow these things. What this frame broadly means, importantly, is that all of their arguments become significantly less important to the extent that we are able to benefit more people by allowing to act for access to education, and they affect far less people by restricting this. What did they tell us in response? The response is very flippant, right? Because they assert that access does not work because this motion makes these degrees arbitrary. That's simply not true. And the response I have is that universities and lecturers and existing structural incentives for unis to maintain their reputation, maintain funding, and broadly do but still exist to the extent where these are mitigated. So Oxford would still require you to get a certain score in, say, your public exams, would still require you to pass the infamous Oxford interview and do these things to ensure that you can enter these places, which broadly means that this argument does not stand because degrees will not be depleted. What do they then say? They asserted, no, there would be less engagement in terms of class and things like that. I think the incentives of schools and of academics to maintain tenure in particular, to ensure good ratings that students have after their classes, to maintain interactivity, to make sure students score well in exams, all means that technology would be used to maximize the interactivity and engagement we already have. The reason why this is less so in the status quo is because all of us are broadly still getting used to Zoom learning after COVID and stuff like that. To the extent where there are things like online polls, you can show more interactive videos, you can have cloud learning to let more different people participate. These are all very good forms of maintaining engagement in class. Then they say, after class things would be harmed. I don't think this is true because societies and things like that can still exist outside of the university body itself. Broadly, we already still have Zoom social gatherings right now. In the worst case, things like drinking societies and things like that still happen. We're still debating here, which means debating societies are still alive. I don't see how the marginal harm that they can have in terms of sports teams and things like that, which admittedly we're happy to trade off for the access of poor individuals who are vulnerable, are so bad. The extent that this stands. They then say, this is bad because this harms other unis because everyone goes into Oxford or Cambridge. The problem again is because Oxford or Cambridge want to maintain their rankings, they'll only accept people from a certain ability, which means broadly other unis by simple market economics still have a suite of people who would want to go into them. The comparative is people who are locked away from accessing Oxford or Cambridge because the plane ticket to the UK or living to the UK is too expensive because of the fact that they believe they can never ever afford these things, or people who are strapped with student debt would be forced to work hours and hours after class because of the fact that they have to pay off these things, are now able to far better access their education in these places as well. Then they said, there would be less research because we would be sort of tied to tech companies, and that's bad. I just don't see why tech companies will be abusive to the extent that they also rely on us as their primary consumer in order to push for their profit margins. But secondly, like broadly, if you want to talk about corporate incentives, corporations do lots of things, as Akka said in PM, to universities nowadays anyways, like sponsoring buildings, building research labs and things like that, which broadly mean that whatever interference they get is marginal at best. Thirdly, and this is key, to the extent that tech is important, more competition will exist, which means tech companies would sort of check and balance bad behavior against each other, and in particular, there are unique actors who are able to do things like access metadata, deal with all these things, which means it will be less on our side because there is this increased competition. What do I want to then talk about? I want to talk about research, because that's like the strongest point. They first assert there will be an inability to do experiments. I want to question, how do schools in impoverished areas, say in different, in like the third world developing countries, actually have research degrees? The solution to that, because next, which only makes sense if research can never be done in these places, which unlike Ivy Leagues or like good schools can afford these things. The solution is quite often threefold. The first, as Akka said, is broadly they partner with public institutions and other things which have these things to allow for things like students' secondment, summer internships, whereby the research can still be done to a certain extent. Secondly, broadly, they push to things online is good because it allows for individuals with access to the internet to do research. I'll later compare what this is actually better than the research you found on that side. But lastly, and this is key, right? Research is only important to the extent that everyone else did that research. This is a relative thing, which is to say, on our worst case, if we push the ability to say cut a mouse or something like that in medical school online from the undergraduate degree to your houseman year, there's no relative loss because everyone has to do that anyway. And I broadly don't see how that's a particularly big loss because companies and hospitals and the people employing you have every incentive to make sure you're well trained, which means probably you're actually getting better training from professionals instead of professors who are less connected to the field with the better resources, with more incentive to train you anyway. Lastly, 5 structural reasons why experiments are better. A, you save a lot of time because you don't need to prepare things online, things like bios, things like liquids, and stuff like that. B, can simulate more accurate things online. To the extent, for instance, you can simulate a human being instead of relying on the mouse. This allows for much better experimental data and result to the extent that modeling happens. Thirdly, you remove physical variables. For instance, different mice have different like small genetic makeup differences that prevent them from being as accurate as an online model. You also remove much of the human error. You don't have to physically prepare your ingredients and go through these experiments. This is super important because to the extent research is good on their side, make it far better. And this goes down the chain of research, right? To the extent that other research relies on this ensures that research is actually good. Then they say, research is bad because schools will strip funding off research. This is so like nonsensical, right? Because if research helps schools by improving their QS rankings, helping you have more publications, attributing good things to your name, I don't see why schools would strip money from this. What schools will likely strip money from, as Atkin said, are extremely pointless things, like for instance in Cambridge having a massive great hall, 800 years old, for people to sit around having great formals with 3-course dinners, a French chef, and like cheese and stuff like that. And probably these meaningless things that we think are likely to be taken away to allow for more access on our side of the house. Lastly, this is also important because it helps schools expand into minority studies to the extent that your student body is more diverse, because everyone around the world can do, which they concede as something that's good. Schools will be more incentivized to do things like look into other places and stuff like that. The last thing I want to say is that probably school gets interrupted quite often in the status quo. You already see COVID being a recurrent phenomenon with the second wave in China. You see, for instance, massive locust issues in like Central and South Asia, which disrupted schooling. We see massive flooding in northern China, and because of climate change and how this has affected our like global ecosystem, broadly these natural disasters are likely going to continue again and again. What this means is that change to online is very important in the long term to ensure schooling doesn't stop and people are ultimately able to get the education that they want. They have better education, better access in the long term. Very, very proud to propose.
Thank you so much for that speech. I would now like to call on second negative. You're here.
Panel, when they discuss their claims, you have to recognize what within their claims is actually unique. Because note, on our side, we tell you that you can still be online if that is needed, but we would prefer that courses were to transition to real life. What that means is that many of the claims that they try to tell you about how like these schools, these universities improve are not unique to it being always online. That is to say that many of the things like tech innovations over Zoom and those sorts of things are things that we can also claim. That is to say that when you have like your Harvard lecturer lecturing at a university in India, that is still something that we can also claim because the capacity for them to do that still exists. What they cannot claim is every single mechanism that Kat told you about why these schools, why the quality of these schools improves fundamentally when you transition to, when decreases fundamentally when you transition away from the online platform. When you transition away from the real life platform. First issue is on who gets more access to university, and second issue is on who gets better quality university courses. First thing is on access to university. Note, this is where they hang basically their entire debate, because the remainder of their material is very mitigatory in nature and provides very little impact on how they actually get better quality university courses. So what do they tell us? They tell us essentially that the most privileged people can access these courses, and that is really harmful. The first thing in response to this is we flat out deny a large part of their characterization here, which is to say that many governments already have incentives to give students who are poor, or give students in general within their country, access to many of these resources and many universities. We see this through almost like the vast majority of developing countries already giving access to loans that enable many individuals to be able to do this. But even to the extent, and we also see this in lower income countries, you also see like the bank loans that are available to these students, which means that the vast majority of this access point gets defeated on principle. But why do these governments have these incentives? Firstly, because these people are going to vote in the future, so there's incentive to make sure that they're educated. It raises the overall GDP of your country, so it's important for governments to make these things. It's also politically popular, as many people have the capacity to access it. What we tell you, though, is the delta on their side is that governments now have lesser incentives to give these individuals access, because what happens is when these university courses have become lower quality, as we tell you, what inevitably occurs is that this is no longer the thing that governments prioritize when they end up giving access to many of these when they end up like delegating the amount of resources that they provide to these sorts of things. What that means is that many of like government loans and scholarships that many individuals have access to on our side, when universities are seen as something that is fundamental and very important, that is lost on their side when these university courses decrease in value, and all they become is essentially an MIT online program which already exists on our side that is free for everyone to access, because they no longer get all of the things that we told you about how it actually improves people's access to many of the important things that universities provide. The other thing to note here is that the majority of people, the other thing that they sort of tell you is that there's this notion of like a principal right, and that this is something that is really important. First thing to say here is that is only useful to the extent to which it improves your chances to get a job or improves your life. It is not a principal right in and of itself. What that means is that all that they do is just claim that it exists and do not provide a fundamental reason why university is unique in a principal sense, and university is unique as to why we should preference it over other forms of education. We should say, why should we not preference someone's ability to get a tradie job? Why should just getting to high school be a sufficient barrier through which you have access and not going to university? They never provide you any of that analysis, so that principle cannot stand in the debate. At the end of this, I think we have largely removed the vast bulk of this analysis about access for these students. But let's say that you're convinced that, you've got that one foreign student who's now able to go to Harvard online, and that person is the one that we should really care about, and that's the impact that they bring. Why is that student still not benefited on their side? The first thing to say here is that there are still many cost barriers that apply to the poorest individuals within foreign countries that are trying to access Harvard online, which is to say that the only individuals that they get within a country like Bangladesh or India are the middle class or upper class individuals, which means that you don't get many of the benefits that they want to claim, which comes from access, because many of those individuals could already get access to the universities within that country, which were comparable on all metrics aside from the fact of getting access to the individuals and the location of that university, which they lost on their side anyway, because the teaching was very similar. The types of individuals who lectured those courses were very similar. Second thing to say here is that the requirements for those universities are still going to be relatively high, and they desire to make prestige. Thirdly, there's likely to be times where difficult to make those things harder. Fourthly, many of those individuals don't have education within the family, so they're unlikely to attend those universities anyway. Fifthly, the degree employability probably decreases because people don't want to, because universities in general will decrease over time. So at the end of that, even that individual probably doesn't get benefited. Lastly, they tell you this idea that, what if a country gets flooded or there's COVID and so you can't go online? I think our model already defeats this argument, because to the extent to which that occurs, we can just tell people to stay offline. There's no reason why that's unique. Okay, second thing on who gets better quality universities. This was the fundamental problem with that second affirmative speech, is that they spent literally 0 minutes in that speech explaining why our monopolization harms do not accrue and are not just crippling and lose them the debate automatically. Which is to say that when you have branded universities that have a bigger name brand, like Harvard and Oxford have a bigger name brand than any other institution in the world, including things like Google, Apple, etc., because those universities have built that up over like 1,000 years, where they have gotten the best alumni, the best individuals to attend those universities. What we tell you is that universities which are less popular and less well known are going to completely eviscerate from existence within society, because they will no longer have demand and the necessity for them to exist. We already have seen 10 to 30% reductions in many universities, such as the one I currently attend, because of COVID and because these university courses seem to be less important when you go to an online platform. Notably, though, those branded universities are still likely to get an increase in overall capacity because they are like companies, because they are brands that are like so influential and impactful. So even though, like the vast majority of universities will not exist anymore, we still, like the nuance there is that still Harvard will still probably get more individuals. What are the harms of that? Firstly, we tell you that reduces the quality of this teaching, which is extremely harmful, because there is no longer competition, which means that a place like Harvard can go ahead and reduce the quality of the teaching that they provide, because competition was the thing that they also relied on to explain why their quality would still, why their people would still be good. They didn't actually provide that. Second thing to say here is that we tell you that the influence of tech long-term in these industries is extremely important and harmful. We tell you that in the long term, it is likely that many of these institutions will be controlled by technology markets, and those things would be really harmful. The response that we get is very bleak, which is very glib, which is just to say that these tech companies don't want to harm their consumer, which is the students. The consumer was actually the university, and so provided that they were able to satisfy the university's necessities, they were able to, and they did not really care about the student and the person. And we know that proctoring companies that already exist already don't care about the students' personal qualities. All they care about is ensuring that their product is good to these individuals. What we tell you at the end of that is that obviously in this scenario, the quality of that individual's university is reduced. They don't have access to things like friends in that university campus, but also that this monopolization means that such a huge a huge number of universities that are local for these individuals are no longer accessible. That was an enormous harm that basically wiped out their access argument anyway. We also tell you in Cat's speech, to very minimal response, that research is not improved on their side because they don't actually they're not able to actually shift the market to benefit the people who actually need that research. At the end of this debate, at the end of this speech, we are far, far ahead in this debate, Crouch and Gate.
Thank you for that speech. I would now like to call on third affirmative. You're here. Third affirmative.
Hi, sorry, my partner's just fetching his timer across the room. Just 1 second. Thank you.
Yeah, no worries.
Hello, can you hear me? Hello.
Hi. Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay.
Hello, you are muted.
I was I muted just now?
Yes, yeah. You.
All right,
I
I'll
think
just
you
start
did
now.
it by mistake. Yeah.
Speakers. The reason I'm unable to access places like Oxford or Harvard or Cambridge, even though I'm able to get the grades and get an admission letter, and I'm forced to be stuck in a stupid place like UHK, right? It's precisely because of the fact that it is far, it is expensive, and I don't have $1 million to spend. And if I do, I have to sell my house. I probably have to prostitute a lot of things, or like even if I don't do that, I'm gonna have to like trade up a lot of things, take on part-time jobs, etc. The reason why we think access is important and it's something that they never ultimately reward is this, right? Say that access is important because literate people deserve to have access to good education. The fact that you're poor, for example, does not mean that you should not be able to access good education, right? But secondly, I think just on a society level, if every individual or like the base level of knowledge of people are able to be increased by virtue of having more people access these things, it will mean a better like society in general, whereby people know more things, are able to understand the things like policies and voting. Also, B, the fact that they are able to better actualize at the point of the day where more educated and therefore unable to have like higher amount of skill set, etc. But three, what this means ultimately, it lowers the competition gap between the privileged elite who go to Oxford and those who go to like Oxford, Brook or whatnot, or who go to like worse off universities like UHK, precisely because of the fact that we reached this step by allowing those things to happen. How does this bridging of that work? So what we tell you is this, right? We don't think that the claim on like how Oxford or like what universities like Oxford and Cambridge will dominate at the end of the day. One. There will still be things like entry exams. There will still be things like the fact that you can't probably you wouldn't probably like just sacrifice quality just for like getting every single person, right? What this means is ultimately if we're going to increase the amount of people you intake for in one unit in one semester by like maybe 50% or 20% or whatnot. The thing here is that if every university is able to increase the access, increase the number of people they intake by virtue of like them having a marginal increase in the number of people taken, it means that across the board, every university taking a bit more people that are from a slightly lower like, level of like education compared to the comparative. Now, what this means is ultimately all you get is a shift up of the spectrum of education level. Secondly, the fact that individuals like me can conceptualize that I'm able to access this space and not having to pay a fuckload of money is the reason why I ultimately think that people like me will ultimately be more inspired and so maybe more like willing to fight for these places and enter these places at the end of the day. What this means ultimately, I think access is ultimately very important that ultimately have not responded to this argument. But secondly, right, what do we think is the main straight out that they gave you? So what they say is this very wishy-washy argument about look, offline education is very important. If you feel like classroom interaction, campus interaction, if that's like invasion of privacy, look, I think that all of these like benefits are literally unimportant compared to the fact that poorer individuals have the ability to access more education or envision themselves as being able to access more education, leading to them wanting to do things to access those education. But B, the important thing here is that ultimately, if the argument here is relying on you having like things like networking and things like interaction with other peers, leading to you having better advantage in things like seeking a job, what this ultimately means is that it's going to entrench a type of disparity between the rich and poor, by virtue of the rich being able to access the very top layer of schools and the poor not being able to do those things, leading to the type of harms that we're talking about. That's ultimately we say, what do we think ultimately? What do we think ultimately in this clash? Because I think that all these benefits are ultimately going to be very incremental at the very best case. We think that we're going to have to weigh up all of these benefits against the harms, right? And what are the harms that we think like happens in terms of like offline universities. One, the fact that prices are expensive, the fact that I don't think I can enter universities. But B, the important thing here is I'll have to trade off on other things in life in order to access this type of universities in the first place, which is already in the first place very like, unfair and very immoral. The second thing here they want to talk about, right, is like why they say, what they say is like, online universities are ultimately terrible places for a few reasons. One, they say, look, the online experience is terrible. You can't interact. They told you, look, we can just make like different types of online platforms. I think in a world where all universities are online, there's gonna be a lot of like new platforms to begin with. They said, look, you'll go to many universities, all our local universities would die. Josh told you why that won't happen. Things like entry exams, things like that. You probably don't want to have one professor teach 1,000 freaking million people at the end of the day. Two, even if I say the very, very best just comparative, if everybody can go to brand name universities, it means that everybody can access Oxford and the gap in between access to education is gone. Obviously, a very big concern on their side, during this clash at the end of the day. Ultimately, right, I don't think they can say that these brand names will dominate the entire market, but at the same time say, oh, access won't happen. There's a direct contradiction in the very state. And then said, look, it's going to be very cheap, right? So you can afford a lot of good things like higher class teachers at the end of the day. One, I think the comparative here is, even though these places might be a bit cheaper, they're also going to admit a bit more people. What this means is, I don't think a university will be so stupid as to say, I'm going to charge it at a price so low that I can't afford to maintain like my prestige as Oxford or to give good education in the very first place. But so ultimately what this means is, even if I take the argument that things like governmental loans solve, which A, they don't solve a majority of people because of things like inherent bias and racism and the fact that governments are basically bad actors. But B, if they do solve, we use the same amount of money to solve it better. At the point which I use these things to, for example, buy online access to online programs, access to things like ebooks and stuff like that, and access more tuition at the end of the day. So at the end of the day, right, what this means ultimately is that they don't think they've ultimately been able to engage on like the main comparatives here. And what are the main comparatives in this debate? Because what we tell you is this: they said that education, or quality education, is important because it allows you to have more skills to look for better jobs at the end of the day. This is only true in comparison to other people in the same job market. If everyone do not have access to, on their side, better education, which I don't concede in the first place, I don't think it's a problem because I won't lose to the other person who happen to have an offline education because there's no such person exists. B, this thing happens anyway when this person goes to Oxford, I go to UHK. I can't beat him because I'm not from Oxford, even though we have the same amount of actual education or actual ability. I think this is a comparative with the place an entire debate in and judge the round. But dude, I tell you that at best we lose some benefits, right? I don't think the argument on things like interaction and whatnot is ultimately going to outweigh the fact that we're obviously going to win on things like increased ability to access better education or access education to begin with. Lastly, on research, they said things like practical skills are very important. A, it is not important if I, as a scientist, am competing with a different scientist who also didn't have a practical skill in the first place. B, it's worse off for me if I'm competing with a scientist who have access to better labs and better schools, leading to like journals that have higher impact factor than me because my university is freaking poor and can't afford to buy me a $10,000 machine at Harvard could. But C, what is a Josh overall argumentation as to why hands-on research is inherently pretty problematic in the first place, and therefore the benefit isn't as large as they say. A, the fact that you have things like human error, you have things like variation in your lab setting, like, if you were to say have like 2 mice that you want to conduct drug research on, mice A and mice B might literally have the different genetics and whatnot. Meaning that our comparative here of things like using AI, using simulation, using things like finite element analysis to analyze things like say the shear strength of cells, membrane or whatnot, is probably a better way anyway. At the point where we eliminate all these like externalities that can happen with human error and with like things with like the reason the way we do research. Now, ultimately, what do we think the best? What do we think they ultimately win in this debate? Right? I think they win the idea. If I am a person who has like hands-on lab, I might be a much like more prepared individual when I go to the job market. The problem here is that we can get all of these benefits at the point we do things like internships, like houseman training for doctors, the fact that I can do lab training as a technician, etc. B, remember this. Ultimately, the comparative is that we have to compare 2 different people in the same job market. The point at which we make opportunity and access to opportunity a lot more equitable is the point at which we ultimately win this debate. I don't think we should care about whether or not the rich and the privileged can get better like education if the poor suffers as a result of that.
Thank you for that speech. I'd now like to call on third negative. You're here.
Can I be heard?
Yes.
All the information that you want to become an expert in something can already be held online. Universities like the MIT and Stanford upload all of their lectures to the web. There are websites such as Khan Academy, Code Academy, where you can learn all the skills that you need. And there are blogs and like free information sites such as Wikipedia, where you can become an expert and access the principled, rights to knowledge and learning that they can all get. The reason why university like education is important and different to just things you can find online in this regard is for two things that they lose. Firstly, the experience. University is not just about memorizing a textbook, it's about making friends. It's about critically engaging with a teacher in a tutorial so you can address questions and actually become an expert in the thing you're doing. And secondly, is the probative value of the degree in actually determining your employment. If thinks that university degrees are just not as useful anymore, they'll be less willing to hire people just purely on the basis of your degree. And that means that the principle of access on their side is hollow. They coerce poor students into wasting time on an education which will never get them a job or differentiate them from their peers. Look, their benefit is that now someone can mechanically be like, oh, well, I went to university. That's their benefit, right? Our benefit is we actually unlock people's potential and let them enter the workforce as a critically engaged and educated person. Let's talk about accessibility, because this is literally their only win condition that they focus on all down their bench. They tell us a number of mechanisms why accessibility is hard on their side. They say the tuition fee is expensive, there's transportation costs, there's national boundaries. The first thing to say is that these are all vastly mitigated by a number of other empirical factors, such as almost all universities in the world have a debt system or a HEC system in which you can defer your tuition fees. Almost all universities in the world and all countries in the world have student concessions, so you can pay half price or no price for all transport. And almost all countries allow people to have student visas, so you can cross countries into actually gaining that education. And Arun at second gives you the reasons that government have the incentives to help the poorest. Because firstly, they want societal productivity, right? They want the most talented people working as scientists and as lawyers. And that means they often have to dip into the poor people. And it's an investment with great future returns. Governments know that they can subsidize a student to catch a bus now, so there can be some like the next Einstein. And these are to universities as well, which is why they give scholarships, which is why they subsidize students, which is why they try to make their fees cheaper. The conclusion of this is that the vast, vast majority of people can get access. And the question you have to ask here is, who is the stakeholder that they're helping? Because if somebody is so poor that they cannot defer a debt to pay later or cannot catch a subsidized bus, they probably are also not a person who has a computer with a good internet connection. They're probably not a person who has a sufficient high school education or the marks to actually get into Harvard. And they're probably so poor that they're working in a sweatshop and they'll never go to the uni. They can personally attack us for having a privileged perspective, but they have insufficiently mechanized the existence of their stakeholder, right? The Cambodian student that goes to Harvard under their side is a fiction and does not exist because that person is working in a sweatshop and does not have a high school education. They're not somebody who can actually go to university. And that means at the end of this accessibility issue, nobody is concretely cut off from university. Like most people can go to university. Maybe it's a bit harder, maybe you have to work a part-time job when you go into university. We think that's fine. On our side, we can model in things like subsidies and scholarships to help these people. But what this means is that under the end of this issue, just saying access is an insufficient way for them to win a principal part of this debate. What we tell you instead is that their side actually gets worse for access. Because firstly, we give you the unresponded material at first and second about how universities will now be monopolized. Because universities used to compete with each other geographically, right? Like the Chinese university could compete with Harvard because people who couldn't go to Harvard would go to the Chinese university. And what that means is that when universities get monopolized, and now the universities aren't the hundreds of universities in the world, but just Harvard, Oxford, and Cambridge, it means that they're able to like not lower the price to the degree that they told you about because they can put monopoly pricing, but it also means that in the long term, they can make prices higher and constrain people again, right? This is the classic loss leading practices that companies like Uber do, or how pharmaceutical companies make patents, right? It's like basically universities can, make them super cheap, make them super accessible. And once Oxford and Harvard are in control of all the university students, they can raise the prices to get as much money out of students. And at that point, in the long term, if your Bangladeshi students wants to go to Harvard, they won't have the money to go to Harvard. And also, these units do not have the incentive to keep the quality high once they have a monopoly. But the second reason why it's bad for access is because we tell you, at the point at which an online education reduces the quality of your university degree, or it is seen to reduce the quality of your university degrees, it means that employers are less likely to hire people purely on the basis of your degree, right? Because they see you as initially not as competent to enter that. Which means that the metrics for which they employ people are not, do you have a degree or not? What are your marks in this degree? But it will be like, do you have a degree plus? Do you have the traditional markers of privilege, such as being a confident leader or having a good English accent? Or do you have the connections to get into the industry? Which means that the metric for which employers employ people becomes far more arbitrary, which means that on their side, the poor people that get a university degree waste their time because they'll never be employed because their degree is meaningless now because employers do not think that degree is important. The second issue is in terms of the experience of the uni. We give you a number of harms at First Speaker that are not responded to, about how you lose engagement, which is important for motivating and making people learn better, about how you lose face-to-face classes where people make friends and have interactions, about how you now have proctored online exams which are invasive to people's data and personal lives because you have to show the inside of your room with your webcam and you feel incredibly stressful. And the proof of this is that, the proof of why real life is better is that both teams recognize in this debate that despite the limitations of having a debate on a Zoom call, we still decided to have our prep in the real life with people because we've recognized that interaction is really important to us, right? And then they tell you, well, we can still have a lot of things. You can still have Zoom parties and stuff, but you often need the structure to be motivated to those things. Yes, technically I could Zoom call a friend, but the reason why I'm motivated to go to university is because there's that real life timetable and schedule that I'm structured, that I want to go into. But then they say, well, empirically we're debating online, so people can do these things, but that's because we debated in real life before, right? So we know the joy of debating. The thing is, if everything is online, when the student enters their first year, they have no incentive to do anything. And this is two important impacts. Firstly, it's terrible for society because now people are just less skilled when they graduate, right? This means engineers who build bridges are less expertise and build bridges which collapse. It means that doctors have less expertise when they're cutting up a body. And this is where it's most ludicrous. They're like, well, you don't lose if you lose the practical experience of being a scientist, that's fine because the other scientists also don't have practical experience. But that just means both scientists are incompetent and you just have two incompetent scientists entering uni, right? But the other thing is you kill societal efficiency, right? Because now employers are less confident in your skills because you haven't done the practical training, because uni is less good. It means they put you on entry-level jobs far longer, which means that it takes 15 years rather than 10 years for a doctor to actually be able to perform surgeries on people. Lastly, in terms of society, we tell you, you reduce the diversity of thought because of the monopoly of units. We tell you about the long-run tech influence of unis with corporate perversion and lobbying leverage. Things like Facebook controlling elections or what public research enters. Things like, and we also tell you get less research overall. Things like research into vaccines, monetary policy, climate science. The fabric of critical democratic society is absolutely destroyed on their side. And those are harms that they never respond to. For these reasons, we're very proud to oppose.
Thank you. Now calling on reply, you're here.
Panel, side affirmative team run a case of pure mitigation because they say things can be simulated, you can watch experiments online and it will just be as good, but they never attest to the thing that is when you go to university and can share a coffee with a friend, when you can tap the person next to you and have a good conversation with them and meet someone for the first time and know what their interests are and be genuinely happy. That is what gives people meaning and makes them want to attend university in the first place. At the point where you turn university into an incredibly isolating and individual experience where the only thing I do is wake up every day to sit in front of a computer screen, that was disempowering, that was boring, and that was something which was going to make me deeply, deeply unhappy and something we ought to not support in this debate. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is access and secondly on quality. So the first thing on access, this is the only real way side affirmative wins this debate, and it is so that you have a principal right to education. We give you many reasons why this is not true, because firstly, there is already universal primary and secondary education, which means you already have a fulfilled principle that people are being educated. Secondly, access is a contingent principle because unless they mechanize why a university degree will uniquely lead to more financial mobility for poor people, it is unclear to me why it is incredibly important, right? And we tell you to no response down the bench that at the point where maybe everyone can attend university, like say what side affirmative wants to push, your university degree becomes greatly devalued, which means it will be unlikely to benefit a poor person in a meaningful way in being able to gain some degree of financial mobility because now they're the same as everyone else. And as a result, when you determine who gets some point based on arbitrary factors and traditional marks of privilege, that was going to uniquely disadvantage the stakeholder they wanted to care about most, which is why this principle was a lie and was a hollow lip service to just some debater wokeism. The third thing to tell you here is that there are reasons why people just do not want to attend university, right? Or can't or won't attend university, right? Because we tell you that firstly, some people's families do not instill these values, and secondly, it takes a lot of time and effort to still attend online classes, and often it is just better off to work a job instead of attending a university which isn't going to get you a higher paying job anyway. The third reason we tell you is that maybe you have unstable internet and poor connection, and thirdly, we tell you that maybe universities are also going to have admissions fees, admission cutoffs, so you can't even pursue the degree you wanted to do in the first place. And tell you fifthly, vocational courses are also totally fine. It is unclear why university is really important, which as a result means that the access they have here is something which is actually incredibly contingent and something which is that's totally unnecessary to the extent we proved that in the status quo. We already have many mechanisms to subsidize and increase access to poor people, whether it is scholarships, whether it is the ability to defer HECs, or whether it is to have concessions on transport. These are all the reasons why we tell you access in the status quo is sufficient, which means the increased amount of access like permanently moving onto online is something which is unimportant and something we ought to not trade off for the quality of life we get in-person university. And that's the second issue I'm going to talk about, why quality is more important and why we win the debate here. Because we tell you five things. We tell you you're likely to get reduced quality because first, you get worse engagement, second, you have a worse social life, third, you get a lack of practical hands-on experience, fourth, your privacy gets invaded by online proctoring, and fifth, there is a reduced amount of money because everything is supposed to be cheaper, which means you can put less money into research, Affirmative's only response is these are incredibly privileged and also you can simulate everything. And so firstly, at best that is just pure mitigation. But secondly, it's just silly because education quality is important if you wanted to have the incentives for people to go to university in the first place, right? The reason why you ought not make this trade-off is because access is contingent upon quality. If people do not see university degrees as important, they do not see it as a worthwhile venture, it means that it doesn't matter if everyone can go to university, if they don't want to in the first place because it's a shithole experience, then as a result, people just will opt out of it entirely, which is why you ought prioritize the quality of education the person is likely to get in person over any of this online stuff which side affirmative wanted to talk about. We also gave you a few harms of monopoly. We tell you that this means small institutions go bankrupt. We tell you this reduces the amount of intellectual diversity. We tell you this reduces quality and because there is no competition mechanism. And then lastly, that tech firms also have perverse incentives to corrupt research, and that was particularly negative. So at the end of this debate, we tell you that access is the increased amount of access side affirmative get is likely to be unimportant, but also that secondly, the massive increase in quality can never be compensated for just like having an online Zoom coffee date. Very proud to oppose.
Thank you, speaker, for that speech. Now calling on affirmative reply to wrap the debate up. Thank you.
Hello, am I audible?
You're clear, yes.
Just give me 1 second to connect with speaker really quickly, and then I'll jump in, all right?
Yeah, sure.
That's lovely, thank you. Am I still audible? I'm in this speaker?
Yes.
That's lovely. Just 1 second with my time, all right? I'm still audible, right? Just making sure.
Yep.
Yeah, lovely.
Yeah, perfect.
I'll be starting in 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Nick loses this debate immensely because at this point, it's too late for them to respond to the frame we've already given that access is far more important than whatever quality they talk about. I'll structure this speech in terms of the contradictions on Nick's bench. First contradiction on access, second contradiction in terms of the value of the degrees, third contradiction in terms of harms. Firstly, access. Notice Nick cannot claim both. That there is a lot of mitigatory measures that still ensure some degree of access, and also that access would be so immense on our side that there would be too many people in Oxford, there would be a monopoly, and also degrees would be vastly unimportant because everyone goes to Oxford. These are inherently contradictory things that they cannot both claim, as pointed out down the bench to no response. We say that access is clearly better on our side for so many reasons. We've already talked about why A, the fact that you do not have to pay for stuff like accommodation, like stupid halls, like formals and stuff like that means you can redirect this money into lowering your fees and improving your education. We also talked about why visas in particular, which is a late point brought up in AFWIT, that these things are quite unpredictable as you see it from the ICE in America. These are things that impede access to a very large degree. Their only response is super mitigatory. They just assert, but scholarships exist anyway, and these things are costly, and access to the internet is low. Notice, first of all, that as always said, access to the internet is not as low as what they say on the top of the house. Broadly in developing countries, you get stuff like, for instance, micro SIM cards are quite common. You get internet very easily. Online banking is so prevalent in these areas broadly. You're at least see, for instance, access to public internet being done by state facilities. Just leg push in terms of there being no internet is simply like unconvincing. But even more importantly, right, I think we uniquely tell you that access is improved because to the extent that access is not only constrained by money, but also things as Atlas said, like the capacity you have as a university to house a number of students means we broadly increase access by these metrics as well. The response to scholarship is so unconvincing because broadly, if my access is cheaper, I can presumably get the same scholarship for pay it to more people, which means again on that these mitigatory responses are unconvincing and we get far more access on our side of the house. When they assert that there's like an imaginary person who's literally boy is an example of someone who decided not to get a better education because of the fact that he cannot access these things because of things like cost of living, as he talked about, geographical barriers. All these things mean that we win that crash significantly. Second contradiction. They cannot both say that degrees will be extremely pointless on our side, but say there will be monopoly pricing and Oxford and Cambridge will dominate because if degrees are pointless, no one's going to buy the monopoly because no one's going to pay for them. I don't know which is the status quo that they're defending. This is extremely contradictory. We uniquely told you why monopoly pricing or deflation of degrees are unlikely because A, price points mean universities will price things equitably to the extent that the sales volume of having more students being able to pay for this outweighs the net profit you gain from pricing this expensively. Your unis are able to find a good equitable price point to ensure that people are not overpriced. But secondly, even in active speech, you already said that unis care about reputation to this extent. They're not going to take in literally everyone, such that there's so much of a monopoly. Probably like the bell curve means we aren't all as smart, and there are people with the best good grades that Oxford or Cambridge don't get it, that the unis that they talk about do get it. In the worst case, at worst, we still allow some people who could not get education at all to get some degree of watered down education. We think that's still broadly good. The last thing I want to talk about is in terms of harm, because notice to the extent that NEC kind of cheaply concedes, we're okay with things going online to some extent, but not to others. It means that they themselves concede to a large degree of harms that happen on their side because their harms uniquely tied to the online mode of teaching, which means that the marginal delta that they have in their case is far lower because they concede that this can happen in certain instances. Notice in particular, a lot of their harms are already dealt with in my speech when I said schools have an inherent incentive to teach well, to encourage social interaction, to have good classes. Broadly, this is what maintains their rankings and ensures readership and things like rankings on the QS. All these things probably mean that the harms they talk about in terms of like losing quality of teaching and stuff like that do not go down. They go up because now schools have more money to invest in these things, to have professors from other places to broadly get all these things, which means that education on net is far better. We not only ensure access on our side, but also the quality of education wins on our side as well. Ultimately, all these contradictions mean that case crumbles to shreds. Very, very proud to propose.
Thank you. The panel will now deliver.